Rice.
Mr Acting Deputy President. I'm very pleased to be able to rise to speak to oppose this TPP legislation, because this legislation is appalling, it is atrocious, it is so damaging to Australia on so many grounds. We've been debating Trans-Pacific Partnership legislation for many years, and we haven't yet signed off on a TPP agreement. And it's no surprise, because it's been hugely controversial for many years. And this latest iteration of this TPP agreement is just as bad as those that we have been debating over those years and years and years. This is fundamentally bad legislation. On the grounds that this is going to be this wonderful economic bonanza, we are being asked to trash too many things that Australians hold dear. And Australians are having the wool pulled over their eyes because they do not know what is in this legislation. This is fundamentally bad legislation. It is a bad deal for ordinary Australians right across the country. It's a bad deal for workers, and it's an appalling deal for our environment and our future. But of course it's a good deal for the big multinational corporations who are already taking Australia for a ride. And that's the nub of it. That's why this legislation is being moved through this parliament. It shows who has got the power. It's not the ordinary Australians, it's not the workers, it's not our environment and our future. It's the profits of these big multinational corporations that are dictating both to the government and, very sadly, to the Labor Party this legislation. And the really sad thing is, when you look at the evidence about the supposed economic benefits that are going to flow through to us, they are actually totally illusory. It's not even good for our economy. I mean, we've come to expect such bad legislation from this right-wing government that we've had to put up with for the last few years, the last 5 years. Because we've come to expect that this right-wing government is in the pockets of these big multinational corporations. But it is very sad, it is very disappointing to see that the Labor Party have kowtowed to these same interests. This legislation is also being supported by Labor, but as we know, it's actually only part of Labor. We know that there are many ALP members, including senators in this very place, who have vehemently protested about this legislation, who know the damage it's going to cause to the country, and they're vehemently against this deal. But they've lost. They've lost in the Labor caucus because the numbers in the Labor Party, who are also in the pockets of the same big corporations, those who also benefit from the same revolving doors, who do the bidding of the coal, gas and oil lobby, who do the bidding of the big pharmaceutical companies, who do the bidding of the big agribusiness, those people in the Labor Party have sadly won. And it shows you the state of the Labor Party today, that you cannot rely on them to be doing what they say they're going to do, to be standing up for workers, to be standing up for our environment, to be standing up for the interests of ordinary Australians. No, they are happy to sell them out because of the pressure from those big multinational corporations and their shareholders. The Greens support trade. We know we are a nation that, we're an island nation. We cannot pull up the shutters to the rest of the world. We rely on trade. The Greens support exporting and importing goods, but it needs to be fair trade. We don't have to tie ourselves to every trade agreement that comes along without proper scrutiny and without fierce negotiation. And on this trade agreement, the negotiators have failed. This agreement is not in the interests of Australia. I mean, let's talk through its problems. Trade can sound very complicated, and in fact I know that your average Australian, when you start talking about trade deals, when you start talking about investor-state dispute settlement provisions, they turn off. They think, oh no, it's too complicated, we'll just leave it to the government to sort it out. But they can't do that. I mean, today, the big news, just as I was coming in here, we've heard the big news that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are expecting a baby. That was, headlines of notifications on The Guardian, The Age came through on my phone. That's the sort of stuff that this government is hoping is going to be, piquing the interest of ordinary Australians. But let's not get them thinking about the TPP. Let's not get them thinking about what is going on in this chamber tonight. I mean, trade can sound complicated. But what people need to realise is its impacts on everyday decisions, on everyday activities, on the everyday well-being of ordinary Australians, much more than whether the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are having a baby. And there are two reasons, fundamentally, why this is bad legislation. Two big areas where it fails. One is the inclusion of the ISDS provisions, and the second is the lack of labour market testing. So let's talk about the ISDS provisions. I mean, fundamentally, this is why we have been debating the TPP over many years, is because of how appalling a deal having ISDS provisions is for Australia. These ISDS provisions, they strike at the heart of our democracy, of our ability to be able to make decisions about what's in the interests of Australia, our environment and our future. ISDS provisions expand the right of multinational corporations based on legal concepts that are not recognised in our national system, and they offer advantages that are not available to domestic investors. And what that means is that where you've got ISDS provisions within a trade deal like this, that corporations, those big multinational corporations, who I know are not making decisions based on what's in the interests of ordinary Australians, they are making decisions on what's in the interests of their shareholders and their owners. Those corporations, they can sue governments who are making decisions that they have decided are in the best interest of their citizens and their environment. And it's not just the Greens scaremongering and saying this is a problem. There is so much evidence already in the public domain and hard examples where ISDS provisions have been used by corporations to sue governments. So, yes, Australia with Philip Morris, for 4 years we battled with the 4 years under ISDS provisions over plain packaging laws. But while we won, yes, Senator Birmingham, through the chair, Senator Birmingham, that case resolved in favour of Australia, it was only because the tribunal ruled it had no jurisdiction to hear the case. That's right, and there was a huge amount of money that was spent fighting that. It wasn't because the tribunal didn't say, no, the corporation hasn't got the right to do that. No, it ruled that it had no jurisdiction to hear the case, not that the corporation was told that it didn't have the right to do it. So that was the Australian example, but there are so many other examples. And I know that my colleagues have been through many of them already tonight. But it's worth going through some of them. I mean, it is in the 2016 Swiss pharmaceutical company Novartis, who filed an ISDS dispute against the Colombian government over the government's plans to reduce prices on a patented treatment for leukaemia. Then we've got the examples of 2017, where the Canadian Bear Creek Mining Company was awarded $26 million from the Peruvian government because it cancelled a mining licence when it was realised that the company had failed to obtain informed consent from Indigenous landowners. So it followed through its requirements to try to get that consent, to be making good quality decisions in the interests of Peruvian people, and they were sued by a Canadian company to the tune of $26 million. And they had to fight that case as well. They had to spend the millions of dollars to fight that case in the international courts. And we know there was the case in 2015, where a US company won millions because its application for a quarry development it was refused for environmental purposes. Millions of dollars, because those environmental controls and legislations went against the interests of that multinational corporation. It's the problem with ISDS provisions, which is why they are extremely controversial and why the European Court of Justice made decisions in 2017 and 2018 and found that ISDS was fundamentally incompatible with national sovereignty. And so consequently, any trade deals that the European Union is doing, they are not proposing any form of ISDS. We know that New Zealand doesn't support ISDS provisions in its trade deals, and Australia should not support them. And we've got the Labor Party who are saying, oh, we don't support them either and we're going to negotiate after they've signed the deal to get rid of them. Come on, they're in cloud cuckoo land. They are not going to be able to do that. If the Labor Party are serious about not wanting ISDS provisions in the TPP, then they have to vote against this legislation. Otherwise, they are trying to fool the Australian public, trying to pull the wool over their eyes. And we know that you don't even have to go down the track of actually being taken to court. Just by having the ISDS provisions hanging over the heads of governments and Australian governments, it creates that regulatory chill, and it causes governments to delay or reconsider regulations and legislation, and particularly environmental legislation, particularly labour legislation and health and safety regulations. It actually makes governments step back and say, oh, I don't think we can change that because we might be sued through ISDS provisions. So that's fundamentally, if you think about some of the legislation that needs to be changed in Australia, that having ISDS provisions would put us at risk of being sued. Think about the huge issue of the climate emergency that we are facing, where the IPCC last week said that we need to take drastic action. We need to be reducing our carbon emissions to keep the planet to less than 1.5 degrees warmer only half a degree warmer than it is now. We need to have drastic controls to be rapidly getting us out of fossil fuels and rapidly increasing the use of renewable energy. But if we were to take the type of action that's required to say, all right, maybe there needs to be a price on carbon, maybe there needs to be an export tariff on coal, maybe there needs to be extra provisions to support the rapid take-up of 100% renewable energy. And perhaps we need to expand the Renewable Energy Target, the whole suite of policy measures that the Greens support that are going to be needed for Australia to play its role in reaching zero carbon economy. All of those would potentially be we would put us in a place of potentially being able to be sued because of changing our legislation. If we think about our mining industry, and the mining sector, of course, is one where we know that there is huge domination by multinational corporations in our mining activities in Australia. The Senate Committee, Environment Committee is about to report on our inquiry into rehabilitation of mining sites. And I won't preempt what our report says before we're tabling it this Wednesday, but I can tell you it's got some recommendations. There need to be some changes in the way that mining operations happen in Australia. We need to get more controls. We need to make sure that mining companies are much better regulated so we don't end up with the huge legacy problems of environmental disasters from abandoned mine sites in the past. These sort of measures that legislation could put in place following the recommendations of our Senate Committee, they are just the sorts of measures that those international mining companies could say, oh no, we don't like the fact that you're doing that you're making life that much harder for us, that you're going to be reducing our profits that much because we're going to have to spend more money in order to put more environmental controls into place. Just like that Peruvian mining company. We know that we would be opening us up to extra litigation, opening us up to being sued. This is the fundamental and really dangerous road that we're going down by signing off on this Trans-Pacific Partnership with these ISDS provisions. The second area of work, of course, is the fact that this legislation that we are being asked to support doesn't include provisions for any labour market testing. And the TPP 11 commits Australia to accepting unlimited numbers of temporary workers from Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico and Vietnam. And again, although the Labor Party might say, oh, we'll change that afterwards, you will not be able to. You're kidding yourself and you're kidding the Australian people if you think you're going to be able to change and renegotiate this after it's signed. And these workers will be spread across a wide range of professional, technical and skilled trades occupations. And the agreement does not require that there be any labour market testing to establish whether there are local workers available first, and which weakens our domestic labour market and exploits temporary workers at the same time. We know what the problems with having a lot of temporary workers coming in and being tied to one employer. I was on the Senate inquiry that looked at temporary work visas, and we know that it opens up to the exploitation of those very workers, as well as denying Australian workers the job. Those migrant workers remain tied to one employer for the course of their time in Australia, and they face deportation if they lose their job for any reason. And again, we are not against having migrants coming to this country and migrants working in this country, but there need to be controls over it. We do not need to have a situation where there are unlimited numbers of temporary workers that would be available and able to come to Australia to fill these jobs without any labour market testing first. The Fair Work Ombudsman reported that temporary visa holders accounted for 1 in 10 complaints to the agency in 2015. These risks of exploitation are not hypothetical. They are happening right now. And if by signing this agreement we open the doors to vastly more numbers of temporary workers, that exploitation is going to continue to occur because it's structural. Where you have a temporary worker coming in, being tied to that employer, one employer, that employer has got incredible power over that worker. That employer can say, well, you've got to do that even though you think it's unsafe. You are going to work longer hours. You are going to be working in unsafe conditions. And if the worker dares to complain, well then he's out in his ear or she's out in their ear, out in her ear. There is no... The power imbalance means that this is an inevitable aspect of having temporary workers coming in with these sorts of arrangements. And then finally, we've got these huge problems, but why are we doing it? Well, supposedly because there are huge economic benefits. Now, I know my colleagues have gone through the complete lack of evidence as to what the economic benefits are going to be. That after 15 years, if we sign up to this, after 15 years we're going to have an increase in our GDP of 0.6%, which of course represents growth between 0 and 0.1% per year. Absolutely less than a rounding error. It's somewhere between nothing and a rounding error. And then, as my colleague Senator Seward has told us, that the job losses in Australia, their modelling shows, would total 39,000 after 10 years. This is a shocking agreement. It's a shocking agreement that the government is putting up, and it's shocking that the Labor Party are trying to ram it through as well. It's one of the most shocking agreements in a generation, and one so bad that there are many Labor MPs who think it's a terrible idea. And it shows that the Labor Party, as well as the government, cannot be trusted to stay true to their values. The Labor Party say that they remain true to workers, and then they sell them out to do a deal with the government over the TPP. The Labor Party say they care about the environment, and then they refuse to condemn the climate bomb that's Adani. The Labor Party say they support refugees, but then they are happy to keep on working with the government to lock children up in overseas detention. Right now we have a situation where the big corporations are dominating and dictating to the government and also to the Labor Party of what's happening on. So right now you the community need more Greens in the Senate to keep both of these parties to account. We will not let the government and the Labor Party do what they want.
Senator Rice, your time has expired.